Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. Today I want to talk to you about a provision that you might have noticed is missing from the revised Form 41 Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. And it is the provision that would have allowed you and the buyer to agree that you will filter listings. The prior version of Form 41 allowed you and the buyer to check a box that would have been the buyer's instruction to the buyer broker that if the seller is offering no compensation or less than what the buyer is obligated to pay, that the buyer broker could somehow filter that listing out and either not introduce the property to the buyer at all or not show the property to the buyer based on the agreement of the buyer and the buyer broker. That provision is gone from the revised Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement because realtors, you can't do that anymore. Many of you will say, understandably, but wait a second. It's not me who wanted to filter listings in the first place. It was the buyer. It was the buyer saying, I don't want to fall in love with property that I can't afford because the seller is unwilling to pay compensation. So if you have a property that would otherwise be perfect for me, but the seller won't pay the compensation and you already know I can't pay the compensation, then I don't want you to introduce that property to me. But you're not allowed to do that. Instead, when you send listings to the buyer, listings that you believe are suitable based on the buyer's preferences to you, and the buyer says, I'm interested in this property, and there's no evidence that you can see that the seller is willing to pay compensation, then you pick up the phone and you call the listing broker and you ask that question and you give that information to the buyer before the buyer ever views the property. And if the listing broker's response is bring us an offer, who knows what the seller's willing to do, then you tell that to the buyer before the buyer shows the property. Before the buyer sees the property. And if the listing broker says, yep, no, at this price, seller's not paying any compensation to buyer broker, then you tell that to the buyer, and you empower the buyer to make their own decisions based on all of the facts that are actually relevant to the property that they may or may not choose to go view. It's probably not the answer that many of you want. It's probably not the answer even that many of your buyers want, but it is part of the new landscape that is the brokerage industry. No filtering of listings. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please ask me a question by visiting warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.